So I've titled my paper, Minoritizing English, Anglo-Indians as a Linguistic Minority in India. In this paper, I examine a call that Frank Anthony, the president of the All India Anglo-Indian Association from 1942 to 1993, had made in the Indian Parliament in the year 1959. This call was intended to constitutionally codify Anglo-Indian citizens of decolonized India as an officially recognized Indian linguistic minority. Through this codification, Anthony believed he could protect Anglo-Indians from the many regional cultural nationalisms plaguing them in the immediate aftermath of the formal decolonization of India. Anthony's projected means of securing such protection was by underscoring English as the language of a statistical minority in India, the minority in question being, of course, the Anglo-Indians. This move, according to the stipulations of the 8th schedule of the Constitution of India, would extend cultural and legal safety to Anglo-Indians precisely because they would be juridically recognized as an Indian linguistic minority. While Anthony's plea in Parliament to achieve this goal failed, I suggest that Anglo-Indians may, however tenuously, nevertheless be viewed as just such a linguistic minority, thanks to the peculiar positioning of the English language in the Constitution. This positioning, I argue, thus, at least in theory, bears the possibility of enabling Anglo-Indian citizens of India to attain the protection that Anthony had intended to garner for them. The recognition of this possibility, I contend, is necessary in the present day because Anglo-Indians, and indeed the English language, often paratactically find themselves at the receiving end of hostile cultural nationalist trends in the Indian nation. I have titled the first section of my paper, Linguistic Nationalisms and the Management of the Indian Nation State. When the end of the British colonization of India lay in sight, Jawaharlal Nehru, the incumbent Prime Minister of decolonized India, was intent on mapping the Indian nation in a way that would marginalize language as a principle for organizing political communities. According to Nehru, this sidelining of language was important because the strengthening of regional identities would impede the cohesive consolidation of the new nation. After all, regionalisms assign primacy to a specific location and not to a nation as value. For all his attempts to use this argument to prevent the creation of separate provinces founded on linguistic parochialisms, Nehru could not make cultural nationalist calls for local provinces subside. Indeed, after the 1953 decision to appoint a States Reorganization Commission, by the mid-1950s, Article 3 of the Constitution of India had been drawn upon to reorganize multiple states in the south of India along dominant linguistic lines. Article 3 of the Constitution could, by a simple majority, set stipulations for the federal formation of new states and for the alteration of existing states in terms of name or territorial area. The actual intent in having the States Reorganization Commission work in tandem with Article 3 was, in fact, to follow an approach in which states could be created by making linguistic homogeneity an important principle but not the guiding principle. In the final reckoning, though, by 1960, Article 3 had to bow down before cultural demands for the creation of the separate states of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, Karnataka, Bombay and Gujarat. While this may testify to Nehru's ostensible failure to unify India beyond regionalisms, the creation of these discrete states served a significant purpose. It helped the Indian nation state accommodate and therefore manage the multiple cultural nationalisms that had clamored for these states. This management of secessionist nationalisms was, however, complicated by the Indian Constitution's 1950 declaration that Hindi in Devanagari script was to be the official language of the Union Government of India. Indeed, the Constitution's declaration of Hindi as India's official language was partially responsible for the cultural secession of the southern states, the calls of these states for linguistic autonomy having partially emerged from their resistance to Hindi as a symbol of North Indian domination. This complication was enhanced by the fact that the Hindu right, with assistance from Hindu traditionalists within the Indian National Congress, attempted since at least 1951 to establish Hindi as the national language of decolonized India. The implications of the term national language are, of course, nebulous to the present day. Convoluting matters further, though English was the chief language that coordinated the regions, facilitated national administration, and enabled academic communication in India, it was declared India's secondary official language. The primary official language was, of course, a then non-existent language called Hindi. In fact, according to Article 343 of the Constitution, if Hindi was deemed to have developed a full range of expression and come to possess the ability to function as India's sole official language by the year 1965, then the Indian Parliament could subsequently retract the use of English as one of India's two official languages. This would essentially leave no constitutional provisions for the cultural and juridical use of the English language in India, let alone enabling the recognition of English as an Indian language. On a side note, English is to this day constitutionally delineated as India's second official language, a language that is needed only, quote, for such period as the Union may by law determine, unquote. There are, to the best of my knowledge, in fact, no provisions in the Constitution to save English from this fate if it becomes imminent at some point of time. Against the backdrop of this triad of problems instituted by number 1, regional cultural nationalisms, number 2, Hindi as India's primary official language, and number 3, English as a language that could be constitutionally ousted at any point of time, Frank Anthony, in his 1969 book Britain's Betrayal in India, the story of the Anglo-Indian community, voiced two concomitant worries about India's Anglo-Indian citizens. His first somewhat naive worry was that English, being the Anglo-Indian citizens' apparently sole means of communication, the overthrowing of the English language would paralyze Anglo-Indians into silence in the Tower of Babel that was the Indian nation. Now, I call this worry somewhat naive because, of course, Anglo-Indians spoke other languages as well, although most of them spoke the English language as their first language. Anthony's second reason for perturbation was that regional cultural nationalist resentiment against the language of India's colonizers could, and indeed frequently did, displace itself upon Anglo-Indians in the form of physical violence. According to Anthony's rather reductive reasoning, this violence was enacted upon Anglo-Indians because they were the only people in India who exclusively spoke the language of India's ex-colonizers. Now, once again, this is a rather reductive form of reasoning, as I state, because elsewhere in the book, Anthony states in so many words that race and religion are other considerations. In fact, he brings up the problem, and he tries to problematize race in multiple points in the book, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I could talk about it later if you so want. In short, the English language would render Anglo-Indian citizens vulnerable to the ferocity built into the mechanisms of regionalist Indian nationalisms. The next part of my paper is titled, Where the Story of a Linguistic Minority Began. In Britain's Betrayal in India, Frank Anthony writes at length about the lack of federal protection for Anglo-Indians as a statistical minority in decolonized India. According to Anthony, such protection was necessary because, as I have stated, Anglo-Indians were routinely subjected to the violence inherent to cultural nationalisms in multiple states. Anthony writes that while Anglo-Indians, quote, must learn to look to and live among the majority in a particular state, when we recognize that Anglo-Indians have all manner of difficulties, that these difficulties will be accentuated 100-fold because of the linguistic passions that have been aroused in a state. We must provide adequate machinery at the center for their ultimate protection, unquote. It is, Anthony insinuates, because of these quote-unquote linguistic passions that in December of 1953, a prohibition was issued in erstwhile Bombay City upon the admission of non-Anglo-Indians into Anglo-Indian English medium schools. Anthony associates this prohibition with the linguistic parochialism that led to Bombay City being divided into separate Gujarati and Marathi-speaking states in 1960. Simultaneously bearing in mind Gujarat University's 1962 outlawing of the usage of the English language, Anthony deduces that both these instances of linguistic prohibition had sprung from, quote, continuing memories of foreign rule in India, unquote. These memories resulted in regional linguistic nationalisms, transposing their, quote, lingering resentment against the Englishmen, unquote, upon the English language and, by extension, upon Anglo-Indians. English was, after all, according to Antony, the one and only language spoken by Anglo-Indians, who also happened to be, quote, the main pedagogic purveyors of the English medium in India, unquote. Ergo, writes Antony, quote, in multiple states, insidious policies to undermine or stifle Anglo-Indian English medium schools are current, unquote. Anglo-Indians, as the unwitting repositories of memories of foreign rule at a linguistic level, therefore needed protection as the speakers of what could potentially be constitutionally recognized as an Indian language. Antony points out in this context that English, and by extension Anglo-Indians as teachers of the English language, were important to the cultural flowering of decolonized India, English being the only linked language of the country. However, he states, this importance of the Anglo-Indians to India was particularly undermined by those cultural nationalist trends that favored the use of Hindi. The three groups Antony identified as purveying this pro-Hindi ideology were, number one, Hindu traditionalists within the Indian National Congress, number two, the Hindu right-wing Bharatiya Janasangh, and number three, quote-unquote, Hindi fanatics located in the Hindi heartland of India. Antony astutely observes that these were groups that had, quote, in their hatred for English, deluded themselves into the belief that if they destroy English, Hindi, by some magical process, will take its place as the national language of India. After all, the Constitution had already declared Hindi the official language of the country in 1950. The fact remained, though, that by 1950 Hindi had not fully developed as a language. Consequently, the Language Commission called for the curbing of haste in the imposition of Hindi as India's primary official language. Nevertheless, the three conservative groups Antony speaks of brushed aside the call to not impose Hindi as India's primary official language at that point of time. The attack upon English in India was thus, as per Antony, largely an attack in favor of Hindi. The lawyer in Antony grasps a fundamental reason that forced the juridical retention of an encumbering non-existent language called Hindi in decolonized India, despite the language's then atavistic state of development. Hindi was protected by its inclusion in the 8th schedule of the Constitution of India. The 8th schedule was promulgated to protect Indian languages of a frequently regionalist nature from dying out by the extension of juridical protection to the speakers of these languages. In other words, by legally recognizing these languages as quote-unquote Indian, the schedule would help shield them from dying out by shielding their speakers, qua statistical minorities, from cultural attacks. In the face of the threats posed to what Antony referred to on more than one occasion as the language of the Anglo-Indian community, Antony introduced a resolution in Parliament in August of 1959. This resolution asserted that English needed to be protected through its inclusion in the 8th schedule. Such protection was, as per the resolution, necessary because, point one, quote, English is as much an Indian language as the other languages of India, unquote, and number two, English is the one and only language spoken by a specific Indian minority, that is, the Anglo-Indians. These 2 points, according to Antony's resolution, rendered English a language that was, quote, as much entitled to protection in the 8th schedule as any other language spoken by any other section or community in the country, unquote. Therefore, the inclusion of English in the schedule would tautologically ensure the protection, number one, of English as an Indian language, and by extension, number two, of Anglo-Indians as the speakers of this perhaps regional language that could eventually fade away. The calculated irony innate to this claim cannot, of course, go unnoticed. I mean, English is, of course, not a regional language. In fact, it's the lingua franca of the world. Antony's plea for the inclusion of English in the 8th schedule was refused because, by his retrospective assessment, Nehru, as the erstwhile Prime Minister of India, was not a free agent politically, having faced obstacles when attempting to pass the resolution. The refusal to pass his plea, Antony states, was opposed to the full cultural Indianization of English that the Sahitya Academy, India's National Academy of Letters, had already conferred upon the language, having in February of 1959 included English as among the major Indian languages. Indeed, preempting Antony's resolution, the Senate of the University of Calcutta had, in July of 1958, asserted that English should be included in the 8th schedule. For as long as this inclusion was not extended to English, Anglo-Indians, by Antony's evaluation, would remain prone to right-wing nationalist attacks. Indeed, on a side note, English is yet to be included in the 8th schedule and is therefore not recognized by the Constitution of India as an Indian language. The story of English's absence in the schedule, though, has an unwritten corollary that I want to discuss. I have titled the last section of my paper, A Ramification of Antony's Resolution. There was an interesting caveat to the inclusion of Hindi in the 8th schedule. According to Article 351 of the Constitution, Hindi would need to draw upon the vocabularies of the 14 languages listed in the first version of the schedule to develop itself. Needless to say, the absence of English in the schedule becomes pointedly poignant in this context. English was, after all, as the lingua franca and the link language of India, a language upon which Hindi had inevitably and extensively to draw, if only to make itself comprehensible, particularly during its initial stages. In fact, let's face it, had it not been for All India Radio, Hindi would have died out, period. Whether or not English be retracted as one of India's official languages after, quote, such period as the Union may determine, unquote, I contend that for as long as Hindi remains listed in the 8th schedule, the language of the Anglo-Indian community is in fact invisibly ensconced in the schedule in its role as one of the fundamental lexical crutches of India's primary and only permanent official language. Taking this argument along the lines that Antony had used in his resolution of 1959, one can claim that Anglo-Indians are indeed, as per the 8th schedule, an Indian linguistic minority in that their language is listed in the schedule and who are therefore, quote, as much entitled to protection as any other section or community in the country, unquote. In other words, Anglo-Indians may negotiate their place in the decolonized Indian nation state not merely as a statistical minority, but also, if and when necessary, as an officially recognized linguistic minority. After all, Anglo-Indian citizens of India often do speak English as their first language, as I have said, though it may not be their only means of communication, as Antony would have had it. The absent presence of English in the 8th schedule can therefore, in fact, be asserted to harbor the potential to constitutionally accord Anglo-Indians protection from nationalist eruptions of the sort that Antony feared. The procedure of codifying Anglo-Indians as such a linguistic minority may be deemed complete, however tentatively, once the letter of the law extricates English from its invisibility in the 8th schedule. Whither, though, the necessity for this argument that I am making now, at this point of time? My hypothetical answer would be the residues of multiple regional nationalisms, bygone or otherwise, often harbor default animosities toward Anglo-Indians and the English language as paratactically unwanted sediments of British colonialism in a decolonized India. To take the case I am most familiar with, a middle-class Hindu-Bengali common sense is often inflected by disparate colonial-era nationalist elements. One of these elements is the fantasy of the anti-colonial conservative Hindu-Bengali household. This household was a space within which vestiges of the colonizing West, such as the English language and white or proto-white bodies, were not allowed to infringe. Indeed, this model household synecdochally produced the Anglo-Indian question before its time, by popularizing and ostracizing a fundamental component of this question. This component is the now unfortunately well-known stereotype of the Anglo-Indian prostitute. I'll just take 1 or 2 minutes more, if that's right. Anachronistically proliferating a love and longing for this good nationalist household, current Bangla soaps often cast their conniving villainesses as women who resemble the self-evidently quote-unquote fallen Anglo-Indian woman as portrayed in conservative Bangla novels and Hindi films, novels and films that had been published and released between the post-partition era and the 1970s. These fallen women from the Bangla soaps, as with their novelistic and cinematic predecessors, are given to Western clothing and cosmetics, and as if tautologically so, to speaking the English language, recalling the mapped expulsion of Anglo-Indian women from the sexually quote-unquote pure anti-colonial Hindu-Bengali household. The soaps I speak of enable a cultural replenishment of fragments of their ex-colonized viewers' folkloric nationalist common sense. This, in turn, allows the current political dispensation in West Bengal to remain unquestioned when culturally decolonizing the state. It claims that Anglo-Indian rape victims are prostitutes and routinely rids West Bengal streets of English names, replacing these names with Bengali ones until the streets are thankfully no longer locatable even by us. Concurrently maintaining a secular facade, the dispensation I speak of casts West Bengal's Anglo-Indians as a statistical minority that it tacitly coerces into electorally supporting it. Not many Bengali Hindus protest this brand of nationalistically inflected politics that fits in with the cultural memories of foreign rule haunting their common sense. If, however, the configuration of Anglo-Indians as an English-speaking Indian linguistic minority with constitutional immunity is made to cut through this common sense, will the vilification of Anglo-Indian women and the attempts to decolonize West Bengal continue in the same vein? If Antony's Anglo-Indians are to collectively voice their dissent in the language of the Anglo-Indian community, a change in this anachronistic politics of colonial victimhood is bound to come about within a democracy, at least in theory. Alas, we now live in a country that is a democracy only in theory. Thank you.